Hey friends, welcome. This week we are concluding our Torah series online through this video since we were not able to conclude because of the snowstorm. So today we're just going to do it through video. It is an important conversation that we've been part of, and so we do want to bring it to conclusion in our series as we have been navigating for weeks now. So welcome here. If you're new with us, if you're just finding us online, my name is Paul, and I have the honor of being the lead pastor here at Lakeview. And today we are bringing our series of Torah to the conclusion. So I'm going to start with this little bit of this story. Now, one of my dates with my wife Jessica, it was one of these times in our marriage where life was just really busy. We were working, we were in a lot of places, kids were in sports, and so we planned to have a date with a movie to follow after. So the date was going to be go to a restaurant, and then we're going to go to a movie. And so we hurried home from work, we got ready, we got dressed, we were both coming from different directions, and we're just kind of getting things going to go for our date and make sure the boys were okay, make sure they were all set up with supper and activities for the evening so they wouldn't destroy the house, and away we went. And I remember somewhere along the drive as we were going on our date, and I can't even remember how long into the drive or where exactly, but I remember somewhere along the drive, I finally heard Jessica say, "Are you listening to me?" Now, a bit of a moment of panic and guilt pulsed through me. I mean, yes, of course I was listening, but I also literally could not remember what we were talking about. It is as if I was just driving on autopilot. Here I was going, and all the thoughts of the day, all the finished work, unfinished work, all the plans for the weekend, all the things were ruminating in my mind, and I was thinking things over and over. And of course, I heard Jessica talking to me, but as I was driving, I just could not hear or take anything in. It's actually scary, or maybe a little bit amazing, how we can drive and how far we can drive under control, but without really being present, without really paying attention. Are you listening to me? Came the question again. Gentle, but concerned. Okay, what were we talking about? I have to save face. These are the emotions that went through me. I have to save face. I want to make sure I'm on my game. What were we talking about? Okay, I remember saying bye to the kids. I remember getting in the car. I remember even thinking, okay, it's going to be best for us to take Circle South Drive here in Saskatoon to get to the destination. And then I don't remember much. I mean, I remember Jessica talking. I remember even emoting, like, yeah, nodding my head. But I wasn't present or listening. I couldn't remember what we were talking about. Are you listening to me? Came the question again. Of course I am, I said. My reply was met with a kind, but that kind of look, the look that's like, hey, we've been married for 25 years. Are you really going to pretend that you're listening? No, I guess I wasn't. I guess I really wasn't listening. Now, I don't know if you've been in a similar situation where you've been with people you love, but you just weren't able to take in the information. You weren't able to hear what was being said to you. You maybe even heard the words, but you didn't really listen. Maybe it's good to take the heat off the relationship conversation in case you're getting a nudge from a loved one saying, yeah, that's you. In case that's happening, this is not the point of this conversation. But let's remember, some of us grew up with a Charlie Brown cartoon, right? The students are all talking. We can understand their conversations and what's happening. But as the teacher tries to engage with the students, all we hear is like white noise. We hear sounds, but we know and understand that the students are not hearing the teacher, that the teacher's talking is not important to the story. Her presence, or their presence, is not important to the students. So we know listening is easy, but also actually not easy at all. Listening takes engagement. It takes all of us. It takes work to listen well. Now, of course, there's different styles of listening, and there's many of them, but just to name a few, there's literal listening, right, where you can hear people say things, you hear the words, and you take them at surface level, like somebody says, "I'm fine," and you don't read the body cue, you don't read the tone, you don't read the context of the fine, you just hear that they're fine. I heard it, that's good, you just take it at face value. There's active listening, right? Where somebody begins to talk to us and we begin to engage in their conversation. We begin to mirror back their body language, what they're saying to us. We repeat things back to them. We say things like, oh, it sounds like you're really overwhelmed. Is that correct? Am I hearing you right? So there's that active listening. Of course, there's also critical listening. There's listening when we're being in a conversation, but we're assessing the accuracy and the consistency and the credibility of what is being said. We're looking for the story the person is sharing with us. We're discerning whether the details actually align or contradict. So there's critical listening. And then there's, of course, nonverbal listening. There's ways we pay attention to the language and tone and everything that's being said without being said. We look for cues as the person communicates with us. And friends, there's myriads more ways of listening and combinations of all of these together. So listening is not that easy. It takes work and it takes real engagement. So with all of that and listening in mind, can I ask you a question? How many of you have ever felt like someone is truly listening? How many of you felt that somebody's really, truly listening to you? Like really listened to you, like heard you in every way. Like take a moment, just think about that. Have you ever truly been listened to? How did it feel? Did it feel like you were seen, known, valued, trusted, understood, loved? Can I suggest that true listening is the highest form of love we can actually offer someone? I say this because of all our sciences, cultural perspectives, religious affiliations, and intuitions. All of them tell us that good listening is deeply connected to being loved. And friends, listening is the key point in the book of Deuteronomy, our epic conclusion to the Torah series. Now, again, if you're new with us, we have traveled in the last 6 weeks navigating Torah as our teaching series. And very quickly, just to catch us up to the conversation, Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. So we start with Genesis, then we went to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and today we're going to conclude our series in Deuteronomy. And we've been going through Torah as we've been studying the Torah, as we've been looking at these books. We've been doing that. We said we do this because if I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of, right? So we looked at Torah with this question in mind. If I want to follow Jesus, I need to understand the story he believes he's part of. And the first 5 books of the Bible are foundational stories that Jesus says he's part of. Stories that he quotes, interprets, and fulfills. So we looked at the story of creation, rebellion, slavery, rescue. We looked at the story of promises and agreements that we call covenants. And we looked at wandering in a desert. And we looked at how all of these apply to our lives. And how Jesus roots himself in this story and invites us to see ourselves in these stories of creation, rebellion, rescue, wandering, and promises. Now, today, in this conclusion in the book of Deuteronomy, we come to the part of the story where Israel finds itself on the edge of the Jordan River, right on the edge. And across this edge, we see the land that God has promised them. They are ready to go in. And this is where the book of Deuteronomy begins. Now, just again, quick overview of Deuteronomy, and we'll kind of root ourselves in one story. But quick overview is Deuteronomy can be broken into 3 parts. They are Moses' opening speech in the first 11 chapters. Then right in the middle, like from chapter 12 to 26, we have collection of laws. And then again, to conclude the book, the third part, chapters 27 to 34, is Moses' final speech. So right in the middle of this book, right in the heart, lies the collection of laws that outline what it looks like to keep promises and agreement with God and one another. With God and with one another. So while some of the laws that we read in this Deuteronomy book are new, many actually repetitions of the laws we already heard earlier in the series in the Torah that we learned from the Mount Sinai. This repetition actually is where we get the name Deuteronomy. It is derived from the Greek word Deuteronomin, meaning second law. So the book of Deuteronomy is actually called second law. But before we get discouraged hearing that this book is about laws and commands, what we need to notice is that the framing of these laws are these two speeches. One at the beginning, as we said, and one at the end. And these speeches are crucial to our story. And if the speeches are crucial, we learn that Deuteronomy, this book, is inviting us to listen. But of course, as we have already set the stage, listening is listening is easier said than actually done. Aren't these repetition laws exactly where we tune out after all? Right? Like if the book is all about laws and second laws being repeated, isn't this exactly where we go on autopilot and kind of be there, but not really? Isn't this, if you're a Bible reader, the part of the Bible where you're reading chapter after chapter and then you pause and go, wait a minute, what did I just read? What did that say? Am I reading this again? Right? There's a lot of repetition here. And even the 10 Commandments are repeated to the new generation in Deuteronomy. But right in the middle of the first speech, Moses gives us a very famous line that's going to be crucial for us to conclude the Torah, but also to understand the book of Deuteronomy. Right in the middle of the first speech, there's a prayer that becomes central to the story of God. And it says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength." Now, many of you may know this significant prayer. But if you didn't, these couple of verses are known as the Shema. And for thousands of years, every morning and evening, usually twice a day, the Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Now the first word, Shema, literally means to hear or listen, which in Hebrew is pronounced Shema, which is, of course, where we get the name for the prayer itself, Shema. But what is interesting here is the Shema, as special and essential it is to this prayer, the word Shema is actually a very common word in the Hebrew Bible. And it's obvious why. Why? Because hearing is universal activity. The scriptures are inviting us to hear and to listen to the story of God. Now that seems basic enough, but if you look at the other ways that the Hebrew authors can use the word Shema, you quickly see why we started with the importance of listening. In Hebrew, Shema can also mean pay attention, to focus, and act. Respond. Listen and respond. This is why so many of the cries for help in the Bible begin with Shema. Even when people are crying out to God, we read, Shema, hear me as I pray, O Lord. Be merciful and answer me. Right? So for God, to Shema is at the same time asking God to act, to do something. So we start with this plain truth that Shema has dynamic meanings. It is to hear, to listen, and to act, to do something. Now this is where things get a little bit interesting for us English speakers and readers. Now, if you were to venture and to wonder how many English words there are in English, how many would you say? How many words are there in the English language? 600,000 words. And this doesn't actually even count all the terms and slangs that we use today and the slangs that kids keep using today and others are using. It doesn't even account for those. 600,000 words. Now, if you were to venture how many words there are in the Hebrew language, how many would you guess? Would you guess there's more words than 600,000? Same, roughly same, or less? Well, Hebrew language has 8,000, with only about 3,000 appearing in the Hebrew Bible. 600,000 to 8,000 was only probably roughly 3,000 words being used. Now, why is this important? Well, in Hebrew, when you say a word, there are a multitude of options that the word could mean. Now, in English, we can be very particular. If we really want something to happen and we want somebody to hear, we can use variety of words to communicate what we want done, what we want to be heard, how we want people to act. But in Hebrew, you really have to listen well. You have to pay attention to context. You have to listen to repeated patterns, characters, literary styles to truly understand what's happening. So what we learn in Hebrew as we listen to this amazing prayer that starts with, "Listen, O Israel," we learn that Hebrew requires deep listening. So the Shema invites us to see this invitational reality that it actually exists in the words. Now notice again that the prayer in these words, Shema, listen, is also accompanied with love. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. You'll notice that the word listen appears repeatedly throughout the opening section of Moses' speech in Deuteronomy. And it's a word which we'll see holds both command to hear and to respond, as we said. But then Shema also is accompanied by love. So listen, hear, respond to love. So for Israel, to listen was meant to respond, and respond, which meant obeying covenant laws in an act of gratitude for God's grace. Listen is paired with love. Hear and respond by how well you're loving. You respond in such a way that reflects the character of the relationship to the one who's speaking. If this God is gracious, as the Torah is showing us, then your obedience is a response of love. What we're being invited to see and learn is that to listen deeply, friends, is to love well. So notice notice that from God's point of view, listening is basically the same as keeping the covenant, keeping the promise, the agreement that was made. Why? Because God has committed to love people. He's keeping his promise, and now he's inviting the people to do the same. So when God asks the people to Shema, it is an invitation to listen and obey. Now again, we hear the word obey in English, and we could draw a lot of conclusions based on our experiences and based on how the word obey has been used to us. But another fascinating thing about this Hebrew language with so few words, meaning to obey, is reflected on who is asking. There's no separate word in Hebrew for obey. So it's reflection based on who's asking. Is it somebody in a loving relationship that's asking you to listen and to obey? Or is it somebody that may be using power over you that's asking you to obey? So it matters who you are in conversation with. So if you want to say, I will listen and do what you say, you use the single word, Shema. I will listen and I will act and I will respond based on the relationship that we have. So listening and doing are two sides of the same coin. Obey carries this dynamic meaning. It's an invitation, and the kind of invitation is based on who is asking you. And in the context and design pattern that we have in Shema, it is an invitation to what? To a new life. The Israelites are on the edge of the promised land, and God is inviting them to Shema, to listen so they could go into where? To a new life, to a new promise, to something better. God is inviting them out of slavery and wandering in the desert into a new promised life. One that if they Shema, if they listen well, they will love well. They will love each other well, and they will love others well. So Shema. This is why later in Israel's history, when people were breaking their covenants, when they're breaking their promises to God, the Hebrew prophets would say things like, they have ears, but they're not listening. The Israelites, of course, could hear just fine, but they weren't actually listening because they were not shmaing. They were not acting. They were not responding based on the relationship that God wanted to have with them. If they were listening, they would act differently. They are ignoring the invitation to love well They're ignoring the invitation to a new life. They are still choosing, and this is why important, we're concluding the Torah series, they're still choosing the slavery of Egypt. They're still choosing the old life rather than Shema into a new life. To listen deeply is to love well. And let's be honest, as we said, real listening takes effort and action. It requires our full self to be present. Another way that the rabbis later on in the Jewish tradition, another way they would put to Shema, they would say to Shema is to walk on what you hear. Isn't that beautiful? To walk on what you hear. So it is no surprise that we find Jesus, who is deeply part of this story, this greatest commandment, these prayers that the Jewish people would say twice a day, learning, remind themselves of this beautiful relationship that if they listen and respond, it would lead them to love each other well and to love others well. And so when they didn't, and they find themselves in all these exiles and all these places of hurt and pain, as when Jesus shows up, we read, one of the teachers of the religious law was standing there listening to the debate. He realized that Jesus has answered well, so he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now, it's important to note that the rabbis and teachers of the law, they would constantly be arguing about the laws and commands that God has given them. All these 613 or 618, depending on the interpretations of laws, and they would constantly be arguing what's the priorities of them, which ones are more important, which ones we can kind of ignore based on this day or that day. What is God really after? So this religious leader asked Jesus, okay, well, here's second law, Deuteronomy. It's full of these laws. Which is the most important? And look how Jesus responds. Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this, Shema. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And then Jesus did something interesting. He adds a Levitical law to this. He says, and the second, so he pairs them, second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. Jesus, when asked about what is the greatest commandment by one of the religious leaders, Jesus responds, the greatest commandment is to Shema. And the Shema responds in love. So therefore, the second commandment that he ties to the Levitical law is to love your neighbor as yourself. When we listen deeply, when we listen well, when we walk on what we hear, we Shema. So what are we learning here? We saw that the most important prayer in Deuteronomy in the second law is to listen well, which in Hebrew requires us to respond, to act, which is always paired with love, which meaning then when we stand and God is inviting us in this beautiful agreement and covenant relationship to move somewhere, that it's a response to a new life that will lead to love and a blessing. And so Shema, when Jesus responds, reminds us that Shema is a movement. It is a movement of listening. It is a movement. It's from comprehension to action. Friends, so many of us in Canada love to know and understand things. We watch news, we gather information all the time. We read, we watch news, we check out little reels. We're constantly trying to gain information. And we also want to be well informed about faith, don't we? Many of you have heard hundreds, maybe thousands of sermons. Many of you have read many books on faith. Many of you listen to podcasts all the time, read articles, magazines, read blogs. Blogs, is that still a thing? Is blog thing? Okay. Either way, many of us want to be well informed. But friends, what Shema is teaching us, what Shema is reminding us, is information is not the same as transformation. Many of us can answer Bible trivia, retell stories, point to verses. Many of my friends, many of others who have left the church can point and answer so many Bible stories better than many of us. We have all this information. We have all these things that we have taken in. But then we fail at shemaing. We fail at using Shema. We have the information, but we don't Shema well in relationships. with money, with some of our vocations, with our neighbors. Many of us know all the answers, but fail to love well. Because information is not the same as transformation. You see, transformation happens when information turns into application. Transformation is when we allow that information to move us into application in our lives, in our hearts, in our full being present, shma'ing to the call of the information based on the relationship we have. As the rabbis would say, it is to walk on what we hear. The teacher of the law, religious law, replied, "Well said, teacher," he said this to Jesus. "You have spoken the truth by saying that there is only one God and no other. And I know it is important to love him with all my heart and all my understanding, all my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. This is more important than to offer all the burnt offerings and sacrifices required in the law." Realizing how much the man understood, Jesus said to him, "You're not far from the kingdom of God." He understood the man is close. The information is right. Jesus says, you're not far, but it requires application of all that information so that transformation can occur. Friends, Shema that we learn in this second law in Deuteronomy is a movement. It is a movement from information to application. Listening so that we can respond paired and connected always to love. Shema is a movement. It is central to the kingdom of God. So when Moses here in Deuteronomy, when he gives us his speeches and doubles down on laws, he's reminding the people to listen. But not just listen. Lots of us have information. But to Shema. Because the root, the heart, the foundation of this message is all about an action that will lead to transformation. And that transformation is all about loving well. Loving well, we learn in the God story, is all about being a blessing, right? The God story reminds us in the Torah and throughout the whole story of God, throughout the entire scriptures, that to love well is to become a blessing. To yourself, sure, to your family, for sure, but to others. To others, to those that you never thought you could be a blessing to. It is to love well. And when we love well, we show that we are shma'ing? Can I use that? I'm making up a new English word. 600,001. Shma'ing. When we love, we show that we are listening well. And when we shema, when we listen and apply, we can't help but be transformed. Because when we shema, that is precisely when God begins to renew us and act in us. When we shema, when we listen and respond to this relationship of love that God wants to have with us, this agreement, this covenant He's made with us, He begins to fill us with His Spirit. And this is His covenant, His promise to people. If you listen, then I will be your God. I will fill you. I will renew you. I will invite you into a new life. As we all stand on the edge of the promised land, God says, if you shema, you can enter this new life. I will fill you and I will guide you, and you will be a blessing to many. So when we shema, friends, we choose to love well. When we shema, we actually also choose to love people we least like. We do that because that's when God begins to see, that's when we begin to see what God can do. When we shema, we choose to be generous even when it makes no sense. We choose to be financially generous even when it doesn't make sense, because that's when we begin to see what God can do. We begin to choose to notice those who are suffering even when it doesn't affect us, because that's when we begin to see what God can do. In our relationship with Him, when we shema, when we listen well, He transforms us when we act, when we apply, when we step in, living and acting as God is teaching us and leading us into a new life. Friends, Shema is inviting us to listen deeply so that we can love well. Now, this Sunday, we move into a significant part of God's story. As we move from the Torah series, we move into the Advent season, a time of waiting and anticipating. This waiting is tied to God's promise, his covenant to renew and to heal the world. This season is all tied to the waiting of God's promises at his expense to love us well. He shows us how. He steps in. So it's anticipating, trusting that God is who he says he is, one who loves us and wants to bless us. So as we shift gears from Torah into anticipation of Advent, we are left with this central prayer to Shema, to listen well. We are left with an invitation that can change everything. So friends, are you listening? Listen, O Lakeview. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. Friends, God can change everything. His relationship and desire is to transform us to be our truest self, his image bearers, who will then be a blessing, who will love well to all others, who will reflect his goodness in this world. So, Lakeview, are you listening?